let me welcome our second speaker, Liz Jackson, who's Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Ryerson University, and she's going to be talking to us about how low can you go? Beliefs, credence, and philosophical views. So please join me in welcoming Liz.
Thank you. I got some grief recently for some friends for having lame titles, so I tried to make this one a little more fun, but it still is belief, credence, and X, which I was told I'm not allowed to use anymore, but whatever, they can deal with that. I do have a handout. I am pretty sure that it is uploaded on the APA website, but if not, I also put a link in the chat, so I'm going to basically do it the same way Sarah did it, where I'm not going to be sharing my screen, but please follow along with the handout. I think that will just help. So either, look at that Google Drive link, should work there, or I think it should be on the APA website, both. So I want to just start off by saying thank you so much to both Chris's, Chris for organizing, Chris for chairing, and then Sarah for a really fun talk. Really enjoyed that. So if you have the handout, the question I'm going to talk about today is the question of what attitude should philosophers take towards their favorite philosophical views. So the first thing to note is this question that I'm interested in is it is a descriptive question about what attitude philosophers should in fact take. It's not, or sorry, I'm already messing. Okay, it is not a descriptive question about what attitudes philosophers actually take, but it's a normative question about what attitude philosophers should take to their philosophical views. So when it comes to this normative question, I think you might think at first blush that it's perfectly rational and reasonable to believe your favorite philosophical views. But recently, a number of authors have argued that it actually isn't rational to believe our philosophical views. And the thought is kind of like this: well, these views are highly controversial after all. There's tons of disagreement among smart people about almost everything in philosophy, including things like, there can be true contradictions. There's even disagreement about that, right? And so because of that, these authors argue that it's not rational to believe our philosophical views. So I'm going to talk more about this in section 2, but that's kind of the main reason they give, at least one of the main reasons. So today, what I want to do instead is argue that philosophers can rationally believe their philosophical views. So more precisely, I have this thesis on the handout. It's epistemically permissible for philosophers to believe their favorite philosophical views. However, they should have middling or even low credences in them. So one kind of point of clarification about this, I just wanted to kind of clarify what I mean by favorite philosophical views. What I mean, I do not mean defending a theory, even in writing, is enough for it to count as your favorite view. Here's an example. I actually wrote a paper with Andrew Moon arguing for this view of the relationship between belief and credence, the belief first view. And Andrew and I both agree that people dismiss this view too quickly. And, there's a lot of objections to that the view actually has good responses to that people in the literature have missed. So we defended this view together, but I would not call it my view. It's not a view that I hold. So when I say your favorite view, I don't just mean a view that you defend, because I do think it could be rational to maybe defend contradictory views, for example. But I think roughly the best way to think about what I mean is things you would say, that's my view. That's a view that I hold. So for those views, today I want to argue it's epistemically permissible to believe them, but we should have middling or low credences on them. Okay, so here's a basic outline of my talk. In the next section, actually, this is in some ways sort of similar to the thing Sarah did. I have a paper where I talk about disagreement, and I'm going to kind of give the cliff notes of that and kind of discuss in general why disagreement has led people to think that we cannot rationally believe our favorite philosophical views, but then argue that the view that is outlined in my thesis is better than these views that say we can't rationally believe our favorite philosophical views. So section 2 is going to be about disagreement. Then section 3, what I'm going to do is just give some additional clarifications and motivations about the view, maybe respond to a few objections. And then in section 4, I'm going to discuss the Lockean thesis and how the Lockean thesis interacts with my view. Okay, so let's jump into section 2, which is about disagreement. So one of the primary reasons that many of these authors who think we can't believe our favorite philosophical views give is we can't believe them rationally because of disagreement. And the basic idea here is they say, look, so many smart people that have thought about these issues and have similar evidence to you, and, you know, like they devoted their lives to philosophy, they have all these different opinions about philosophical views. And it's hard to see how we could rationally believe something when there's so much disagreement about it. And I think this captures, like, in general, what is intuitive behind conciliationism, which is the view that we should change our opinions in some way in response to disagreement with smart people. And I think part of what conciliationists push is like, look, ignoring the fact that smart people disagree about something that you believe, if you just kind of keep believing that and ignore the fact that there's this disagreement about it, there's something that seems kind of closed-minded or dogmatic about that. Like, shouldn't you give this fact some weight that these smart people are disagreeing with you? So I think that's one of the main motivations behind conciliationism. And I do feel the force of that. I'm like, yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot of disagreement about this from people that have really good evidence and are reliable, potentially, and are smart. So shouldn't I give that some weight? So I see the force of that. But also note that not all philosophers are conciliationists. So others defend kind of the other main view in the epistemology of disagreement, steadfastness. And this is the view that we can maintain our opinions in the face of disagreement. Disagreement doesn't require us to change our opinions. And I think there's some things to be said for steadfastness as well. Here's a couple. So the first is kind of just this basic thought that we can have opinions about controversial matters. Just because smart people disagree with us about something doesn't seem to preclude us having opinions about it. I think it's okay, you know, even for controversial, highly debated topics, to have a view on those. And at least on strong versions of conciliationism, it's sort of hard to see why that would be okay. The second reason, which I think is kind of related, is this spinelessness worry. So I'll give an example here. So let's say you are trying to decide whether eating meat is morally permissible. You read a lot of articles about it, you really think about it for yourself and weigh the evidence carefully, and you kind of come to this conviction that it's wrong to eat meat. So you have this conviction, and then you meet your friend who is a philosopher, he's read the same articles as you, and your friend is totally fine with eating meat and thinks, yeah, we can totally eat meat. If you just sort of, in the face of that disagreement with that smart person, just kind of give up this conviction that you've come to, it seems like there's something spineless about that. And it seems like you should be able to sort of take a stand on the fact that you've weighed the evidence and thought about this, and this is your stance on that issue. You shouldn't seem to have to just change your opinion just because this other person doesn't think eating meat is wrong. So that's kind of the spinelessness worry. A third sort of motivation for steadfastness is that there's actually really interesting research on the epistemic benefits of disagreement. And I don't have time to go into all of this here, but I cited some people on your handout. But the basic idea is that when a group has people that are genuinely disagreeing in that group is actually, there's some research that shows that group is more likely to reach the truth in the long run, rather than a group where everyone's just always conciliating with each other and adopting each other's opinions. So those are sort of three motivations for steadfastness. Now, note here that I framed both conciliationism and steadfastness in terms of what opinion you should have. And I did this on purpose, actually, because I want to point out here that it leaves a certain question open. And that's the question of, well, you know, this is a session on belief in credence, right? So when we're trying to decide if we should conciliate in some way, does that mean we should change our beliefs, change our credences, change both, or maybe change neither? So instead of there just being conciliationism and steadfastness, there's actually four options here, because the term opinion is ambiguous between belief and credence. And what I think is really interesting about my view is that it sort of carves a middle way between these two main positions, conciliationism and steadfastness, in the epistemology of disagreement. So we can acknowledge and give weight to the opinions of smart people, because when we encounter these smart people who disagree with us, we'll lower our credences. or move our credences towards theirs, or, I'll talk about some potential different updating rules we could use later. But because we can continue to believe these controversial views, we can still take a stand on controversial matters, we can avoid spinelessness, and we can also glean disagreement's epistemic benefits. So I have a paper that I mentioned, and also Laura Bushak has a paper. Laura and I tend to agree on many things, and we both have kind of a similar view on disagreement here. So there's a further defense of this response to disagreement. You can look at my paper and Laura's paper for that. But before moving on to the next section, I wanted to sort of address this question: why would we change our credence in response to disagreement rather than our belief? And I think there's at least 4 reasons. So the first is that it can help with this self-undermining problem for conciliationism. And the worry is that if you do think we can believe our philosophical views, but you're a conciliationist, how are you going to continue to believe conciliationism when there's so much disagreement about how we should respond to disagreement, right? And so what's cool about my view is that it enables us to rationally believe conciliationism, but also affirm that conciliationism is right in some respect, that is, in terms of what we should do with our credence. So I think that's kind of interesting. I also think that this will solve the spinelessness worry, because at least when I think about spinelessness, I think that if you can continue to believe your philosophical theory in the face of disagreement, to me that seems like you're taking a stand on it. You're saying this is true. I'm representing the world such that P. I think that believing something lets you take a stand on it in a way that merely having a high credence in it doesn't. So I'm going to talk more about this in section 3, but I guess it's just not obvious that high credence sort of takes the same stance as belief. And when I'm thinking about wanting to have a spine and stand up for my philosophical views, I think it's more natural to think about that as believing them. So I think my view can also solve this spinelessness worry. Third, what's cool about credences is that they're fine-grained enough to capture different updating rules and different rules for how we might conciliate. So for example, some people thought, well, if we're conciliationists, we should simply split the difference with our peers or just average our credences or something. And then there's a lot of worries for that and counterexamples. And Kenny Eastwarren and some others who I actually cite in the next bullet point have some nice discussion of different ways we might conciliate, and it might even be context dependent, and it might depend on who we're disagreeing with and what their exact opinion is and all this stuff. But credences let us sort of capture, they give us this flexibility to conciliate in different ways depending on the situation. Belief conciliationism, on the other hand, it just doesn't really allow us to capture much, except for really basic cases of disagreement where maybe I believe P and then someone else believes not P, then maybe we both withhold. But belief is so coarse-grained that it's not clear how, if I believe P and you're agnostic or something, what do we do there? It's too coarse-grained. So credences give us a flexibility that beliefs don't in conciliating. And I think that's a big reason that it makes more sense to conciliate with our credences rather than our beliefs. And then finally, credences allow us to conciliate in different ways depending on who the disagreement is with. What's interesting about the epistemology of disagreement literature is that I think a lot of it has centered around this concept of epistemic peerhood, and you might have noticed that I didn't even talk about that really yet. And that's partially because I actually don't really think being a perfect epistemic peer is even really that relevant for the question of how we should respond to disagreement. Just take a case where someone isn't your peer because they're slightly more reliable than you or have slightly better evidence. If you find yourself in a disagreement with them and conciliationism is true, then not only should you conciliate, you should probably conciliate even a little bit more. But then if there's someone who isn't exactly on your epistemic level, but is slightly inferior to you, has slightly worse evidence or is slightly less reliable, but is still, a smart person that has thought about this a little bit, it still, again, seems like we should conciliate somewhat, just maybe not quite as much for someone who's perfectly on our level. So it might be just easier for the sake of conversation to focus on peer disagreement, but I don't really think there's anything special about it in the sense that like it's super relevant for the philosophical discussion, but these people that are slightly above us or slightly below us aren't relevant. So, you know, Nathan King has this nice paper where he argues where we don't really have that many epistemic peers. And that might be true, but part of what I'm saying is that doesn't really matter in the end, because the way we conciliate is just going to depend on whether the person's a peer, superior, inferior. You know, maybe if they're an expert, we might totally defer to them. If they're a novice, we might kind of disregard their opinion or only regard it very slightly. So credences, I guess the last 2 points here are just sort of credences give us this flexibility in conciliating that beliefs don't because of how coarse-grained they are. So those are some reasons I advocate for changing our credences in response to disagreement rather than belief. Okay, so that was a little bit about disagreement and why I think my view of disagreement is superior to the one on which we cannot rationally have beliefs about controversial matters, a more strong or belief conciliation view. Now I want to kind of give some other arguments for this view that we can believe, but we should have middling or low credence in our favorite philosophical theories. So the first, so now we're on section 3. I'll talk about 3.1 first. The first point has to do with different roles that belief and credence might play. So a lot of people working on belief and credence, especially Ross and Schroeder, I think is one of the big people here, but other people have said this as well. I think Foley talks about it, maybe Bouchak. And I mentioned this a little bit too, that beliefs play this role where they enable us to sort of take a stand on certain things and let us have a view of the world and let us represent the world such that whatever we believe is true. So if I believe it's going to rain tomorrow, then I represent the world that way. But credences, they seem to leave possibilities open in a way that beliefs don't. So if I believe it's going to rain tomorrow, in some sense, I'm sort of ruling out the possibility that it doesn't rain tomorrow. But when I have only a 0.9 credence it will rain tomorrow, that possibility that it could rain, or whatever, if I say I have a 0.9 credence that it will rain tomorrow, the possibility that it doesn't rain tomorrow is in some sense live for me. And so one role that belief plays is that it lets us take a stand and represent the world in a certain way. And it's not clear that credences can play that role, but that's the important point here is I think beliefs let us take a stand on our philosophical theories. And I think that's important. I think that's important for spinelessness, but I also think it's just, it's valuable to be able to sort of take a stand on a theory and say, this is the true theory, I'm going to champion this theory. Beliefs let us represent the world such that our philosophical theories are true. The role for credence, on the other hand, is the role of tracking your precise level of evidential support. So on the traditional picture, you know, credences change via conditionalization as we encounter new evidence for or against the proposition in question. And not all, note that not all evidential changes need to change our beliefs. And this isn't really that controversial, maybe with the exception of the view that belief is credence one. Almost everyone should agree that there are cases where evidence should change our credences, but need not change our beliefs. So here's a really basic case. I check the weather, I see that the forecast predicts rain. Maybe there's like a 90% chance of rain. So I believe and have a 0.9 credence that it will rain tomorrow. And then I put my phone down, go throughout the day, come back, check the weather again, and now the chance of rain is only 0.85. So my credence is going to go down a little bit that it will rain tomorrow. But that little bit of evidence isn't enough to change my belief that it's going to rain tomorrow. And that's obviously, you know, maybe a less extreme case than one where your credence goes way down. But the thought is that the fact that you can maintain a belief but change your credence is something that most people are committed to. I think it's more of a matter of how much that can happen rather than whether that happens at all. So I think when you think about the roles for belief and credence in this way, it's very natural. My picture is kind of falls naturally out of that. We can sort of take a stand in our philosophical theories, but our credence can sort of track our precise level of evidential support. And insofar as disagreement is at least some kind of evidence that we're wrong, our credences go down as we encounter disagreement with our theories. Okay. I'm actually taking a lot longer than I planned. So I'm going to maybe go through section 3.2 a little bit more quickly the purposes of this section was just to sort of warm up people to the idea that it could be rational to believe something, even if you have a middling or even lowish credence in it. Sarah talked about this a little bit too, although we have different views because my view isn't a context-sensitive one. But I'll just mention a few of these cases. So the first thing that I think is interesting is that several authors have argued that agnosticism is consistent with most or all credences. Laura has a view Laura Bushak has a view on which agnosticism is consistent with any credence short of 1 or 0. And then Jane Friedman has a really interesting paper where she argues that agnosticism could even be consistent with credences 1 and 0. So the reason I mentioned that, it's not directly relevant for my thesis, but it is interesting to kind of get our feet wet on like ways that belief in credence might be more independent than we thought. So I wanted to mention that case briefly, and then I'll talk about some of these other cases quickly. So Martin Smith and others have argued that when it comes to, Sarah also talked about preface cases, but take the conjunction of all the claims in your book. It's at least rationally permissible to believe that, but you should have a middling or even low credence in that. So I'm not going to take time to defend that solution to the preface paradox, but that is a potential case of believing something but have a middling to low credence, especially if you like closure principles. There's also kind of interesting cases of doubting and how we should respond to counter evidence to our views. One case that I've given before is a case where a student goes into a classroom and believing they have hands, and then encounters a bunch of skeptical arguments. Like they talk about Descartes and Hume and all these arguments that you don't have hands, and their credence that they have hands might go way down in that case. But I don't want to just come out and say it's irrational for them to continue to believe that. They might say, but it really just seems like I have hands, even though they're way less confident that they have hands. So that's one kind of case. Another kind of case that Laura talks a lot about in her forthcoming paper on disagreement is cases of a proposition that is very close to the core of your web of belief. So religious faith might be an example of this proposition, maybe a really important moral or ethical view you might hold. And Laura thinks that these propositions are ones that when we get counter evidence, we might seriously doubt the truth of these propositions, so our credence gets quite low. But nonetheless, because these propositions are so close to the core of our web of belief, these underlie really important life commitments, we can continue to believe them even through periods of very serious doubt. So that's kind of a third case. Hawthorne and some others, I think Sarah also mentioned this paper as well, this belief is weak paper. They have this racehorse case, and basically the upshot of it is there are cases where you can believe the most likely of some live option, even if the probability of that is below 0.5. And then Smith has some statistical evidence cases that are sort of the reverse of the ones that Friedman and Bushak talk about, where you believe and have a high credence in something, and then you get statistical evidence that lowers your credence but doesn't cause you to give up your belief. And the general idea here is that belief and credence are sensitive to different features of a body of evidence. And some kinds of evidence might be credence moving, but not belief moving. One very common example of what this kind of evidence is statistical evidence. Statistical evidence seems like it can move our credences around, but not change our beliefs. But there's other accounts that maybe are more general than just the statistical evidence account. So Martin Smith has this normic support account. There's a couple different accounts in the literature, but the general idea is that in some sense, when it comes to belief and credence, the kind of evidence matters, not just like the probabilistic amount or something. So I think that's sort of the general idea these cases are capturing. So I guess the point of that section was just to kind of warm people up to this idea that maybe you could believe something and have like a middling or low credence in it, and not just as a descriptive claim, but even potentially as a normative claim. So then the final section, I wanted to address what I think is probably a common objection that my thesis would face. And that's the question, well, why not just accept our philosophical theories? So when you accept some proposition, you act as if it's true. And if we accept our philosophical theories, we could potentially still defend them in conversation and at conferences. We could still publish in favor of them. We can act as if they're true, but maybe it's irrational to believe them. And Will Fleischer has some really interesting work about how accepting our philosophical theories could at least get us some of these epistemic benefits I talked about of steadfastness. Even if we don't believe it, maybe just acting as if it's true could still help our group reach the truth in the long run. Okay, so 2 points about this. It's something I want to think about more though, so happy to talk more about this in Q&A. I think the first thing is just merely saying you can't believe your philosophical theories, but you can accept them. It's not clear to me that that helps with this spinelessness worry. Maybe you can act as if it's true, but you can't honestly take a stand on its truth. You can't represent the world such that it's true. So think about our meat eating case, the person who comes to the strong conviction that eating meat is wrong and then encounters disagreement about that proposition. You might say, well, that person can accept that eating meat is wrong and continue to not eat meat. And like, that's nice, but like, I want to say they can actually believe eating meat is wrong, even though someone disagrees with them about it. So in my opinion, curious what you guys think about this, that acceptance isn't going to give us the same kind of spine that belief is. So I think to answer the spinelessness worry, we really need belief. We can't just have acceptance. So that's point one. Point two against this acceptance thing. The idea that it's irrational to believe our philosophical theories, it just seems really, really strong. And it's hard for me to get on board with that. I just think, look, like, and maybe I'm just enough of a steadfaster that it's hard for me to see how this super, super, super strong conciliationism could be true. But I just think of my own case. Like, I think I believe some of my philosophical views. I think some of my friends believe their philosophical views. I don't know if many philosophers believe their philosophical views, but I wouldn't be totally opposed to that, just as a matter of a descriptive claim. So all of us that believe our philosophical views, are we really just irrational? Like, I don't know. We've thought about these views so much. We've defended them in print. We've responded to objections to them. I don't know. To me, that seems very strong. So what seems more natural to me is to say that we're not irrational if we believe them, but we're irrational if we're just overly confident and almost dogmatic about them. We're not open to new evidence. And I think, look, this is exactly what my thesis says, right? We should be less confident. We should lower our credence in them. We should have middling to low credences in our theories. And maybe even the more controversial, the less confident we should be. There's a lot less disagreement about, for example, whether there can be true contradictions than something like whether consequentialism is true. So we could proportion our confidence to how controversial they are. But I think my view can kind of capture nicely why we shouldn't be dogmatic. We should be open to new evidence, but also it just doesn't seem irrational to me to believe our philosophical theories. So that's a few reasons why I want to go the belief way and not just the acceptance way. The last thing I want to address very quickly, and I think we started at 3, so I'm pretty much out of time, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the Lockean thesis, and this is important because I think it's going to put a little more flesh on the bones of what I've given you so far. So the Lockean thesis is it's a view about rational belief, and it's the view that S rationally believes P if and only if S has a rational credence in P above some probabilistic threshold. So once your credence drops beyond a particular point, then continuing to believe the proposition in question is going to be irrational. So you might wonder if my view is inconsistent with the Lockean thesis. Well, I think maybe some stuff I said in the section about, section 3.2 about belief in credence being sensitive to different features of a body of evidence, that's probably usually those people deny the Lockean thesis, but I think my bare thesis just about the view we should take to our philosophical theories is actually consistent with a version of the Lockean thesis. But I want to take a stand here, and that is that Lockeans should lower their threshold, at least when it comes to philosophical theories, like a lot, like maybe 0.6 at the highest. So I'm personally not a Lockean. But I think what I've said so far, and hopefully this idea that we can capture the benefits of conciliationism and the benefits of steadfastness, they give us reason to at least reject views on which the Lockean thesis is super, super high. It's also worth noting, and I don't know if Francisca, yeah, Francisca's still here. Hey, so from some cool conversations we've had, we've talked about this possibility that the Lockean thesis is ambiguous between a permissibility claim and an obligation claim. So you could have like a higher threshold of credence where you're obliged to believe, maybe like 0.95 credence, and then a much lower kind of permissibility threshold. And I think that's really interesting. And even the way I actually stated the Lockean thesis on your handout is ambiguous between permissions and obligations. So you could have two thresholds, one for permissibility, one for requirement. Your requirement one could be quite high, but my claims are just about permissibility. So the thought is it's permissible to believe P, even if your credence in P is 0.5, maybe even below 0.5. I mean, it's going to depend on how low you want to go, my title, you know, but I want to say that the permissibility threshold should be quite low. Finally, I want to kind of address this question: should we ever give up believing our philosophical theories? Yes, we should. We can't just believe them forever. Okay, and I'm at 30 minutes. Thanks, Chris. So when should we give up believing our philosophical theories? And this is going to depend on whether you're a Lockean or not. So that's why I put it here. So if the Lockean thesis holds, you have a very straightforward answer to this. That's going to be when your credence falls below the permissibility threshold. And if you buy what I've said so far, most of our philosophical views should meet that threshold, because I think we should have a pretty low permissibility threshold. If the Lockean thesis is false, then when you should give up your philosophical theories is going to depend on when you get the right kind of evidence against your philosophical views, and how we demarcate the belief moving evidence versus the credence moving evidence. That's just going to depend on which view we like, whether we like Martin Smith's view or Laura's view or a different view. But what I think is interesting to note is that I don't think disagreement, even with a smart person, has the same epistemic force as some solid deductive argument against your view that you simply just don't have an answer to and you don't know what to say about. You know, maybe having a solid deductive argument against your view isn't always a reason to give up your belief. It's going to depend on how much evidence you have in favor of it. But it does seem like you could get a piece of evidence that really is like, oh yeah, maybe you should give up that belief. So at a certain point, you need to stop believing. But I don't think disagreement in most cases is gonna have that same force. And it might also depend on, again, how many people disagree with you and how much of an expert they are. So I'm not gonna say, you know, disagreement shouldn't, you know, we should never, ever, ever give up our beliefs in response to disagreement. It's going to depend on the situation. But I think for most philosophers, the views they champion, the views they defend, they can rationally believe those. Okay, so I'm basically done. All I wanted to say sort of at the end was just a couple ways that, I guess maybe this is selfish, but ways that you can help me. So I'm curious about people's intuitions. This is on the 3rd page of your handout, of these cases of belief in middling to low credence. Like, what do people think about those? I mean, a lot of people I've talked to at conferences, especially the Lockeans, don't like them. They're like, that's crazy. But it was really interesting. I taught about belief in credence last semester in my epistemology class, and my students were like super, super open to like believing something and having a credence below 0.5 in it. And maybe I'm just like a really bad teacher and just taught them only one side of the debate here. But I'm curious, I'd like to get more data on like what people think about these, and if they think they're just going to dismiss them because they're just clearly irrational, or sort of what people think. The second is I'm still reading the literature on philosophical views and what view we should take to our philosophical theories. So I would love any literature recommendations you think might be relevant to this. And then the final thing I thought would be interesting to think about is to what extent this would or wouldn't apply to disciplines beyond philosophy, like in the sciences. So yeah, that's it. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that great talk. If you have a question, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom. And again, I'm going to ask you not to follow up here so we can try and get more voices into the conversation. Let's start with Ariana Falbo.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much. So I was hoping you could say more about the spinelessness worry and what was sort of underlying the problem there. So I thought it was just kind of interesting because the main example you used was about the ethics of eating meat. But if the topic had been something like, you know, the metaphysics of grounding or like some metaphysics or philosophy of language, like something that had nothing to do with morality, I don't feel like spineless if I like, you know, abandon belief in my view, or if I think like, hey, maybe I'm wrong. And I feel like, you know, I could still like take a stand in philosophical contexts. I could still defend the view. I could still publish in the view. So it was just unclear to me, you know, like what was really like the worry there, because it didn't seem super pressing, at least in the philosophical context, if I like got rid of the morality bit. So if you could say more.
Yeah, that's a good, can everyone hear me? Did my video disappear? Yep. Oh, okay. I don't know what's going on in my Zoom. Okay, well, we're good. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And so I did give the morality example just to kind of get that intuition going, because I do think when you think about cases where you really have a moral conviction, I think that gets the intuition going the most. But I do think grounding is like the other end of the spectrum. Like everyone's sick of, I don't know, people might work on it. Grounding's great. I'm not trying to say it's not, but it is one of those things that, people might get up in arms about it, but I totally agree that it doesn't seem as bad to just kind of give that up in that case than it does with the morality case. But I do think, and again, this depends on like to what extent you feel like it's your view and to what extent you feel like this is a view that I hold, that I'm championing. I do have that intuition a little bit. Like you decide grounding, I don't even know what a controversial view. There's multiple kinds of grounding, let's just say, or whatever. And you really come to like this conviction after reading the literature and thinking about it quite a bit. And then you encounter some smart person at a conference. And maybe we could even say like someone that's like a stage ahead of you in a career stage, you know, like you're an assistant professor and they're a tenured professor and like they've published more on it or something. And they're like, no, there's only one kind of grounding. And then you just like say, oh, okay, I'm withholding belief now, you know? And again, I'm not saying like acceptance can't get us some of the things. I think it, you know, Will has some really nice papers about how acceptance can get us some epistemic benefits that I agree with. But it does seem to me like there's something spineless about that, to just change this view that you've really thought through. You maybe come up with some of your own arguments for, you've read the literature. You know, we might not have that intuition as strongly as the morality case, but at least I still have it. So that's what I would say. But it's a nice question. I like the question.
Alexandra Lloyd.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a really interesting talk. I'm just going to make it really quick, I guess. So obviously some philosophical views are moral views, and moral views obviously underlie action. And I was just wondering if you think that it's a problem to underlie moral action on the basis of a middling credence. So I'm just thinking of like, I don't know, some decision in bioethics or something like that. Do you think it's a problem? Because I know in the literature on moral encroachment, there's a lot of talk about this knowledge action principle, or outright belief action connection. And so I haven't really heard a lot of talk about credence action connection. So I'm just wondering if you could like say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I think a related question too is how do belief and credence like affect action? Like when do we act on our belief versus act on our credence? And yeah, I've gotten this question, a similar question before in previous talks. So it's a really good one. Yeah, and I think this is going to depend on sort of your underlying theory of the roles for belief and the roles for credence. And one thing I think is really interesting that I don't think I explicitly mentioned when I was talking about that, but is I think related to like the taking a stand thing. So some people like Laura Bushek think that one role that belief plays that credence can't play is this special role in sort of underlying certain reactive attitudes that we have. So practices of praise and blame, for example, Laura argues that we don't praise and blame people in accord to like our credence that they committed a crime. We praise and blame them after taking a stand on whether they committed it or not. And so I think, I think that sort of view would complement, at least my view when applied to moral beliefs pretty well, and would say when it comes to your moral beliefs, even if you have a middling or low credence in them, you can still act on that belief because of this special role that beliefs have to play in practices of praise and blame. But I totally think whether you say that or not is going to depend on kind of your underlying theory of what roles the attitudes play. So I guess I would maybe like to say something like that potentially for the purposes of this paper. At least it would fit really well. But I think there's different ways you could go here. But that's a great question.
Daniel Monroe.
Thanks, and thanks for that great talk. So when you were responding to the view that we should accept rather than believe our philosophical views, you said that it's implausible that it's irrational to believe our philosophical views. Yeah. So I was wondering, why does the proponent of the acceptance view have to say something that strong? So couldn't they say, sure, maybe it's not irrational to believe your philosophical views, but acceptance is better in some sense. So, maybe like you recognize that there's always a possibility you could be wrong. So it's like safer not to believe, but just to accept, to like avoid having a false belief or something like that. So they might think that it's like all things considered just wiser to go in for acceptance rather than belief or something along those lines. Do you think that they'd have to be committed to this irrationality claim, or is there something weaker they could say?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I guess too, maybe just to be clear, like I also think people should accept their philosophical views too. I'm not saying you shouldn't accept them. I think you realize that, but just to say that for everyone. But yeah, I mean, I actually think this kind of view might be consistent with the claim that I'm making in this paper, because the claim I'm making in this paper, I mean, it depends on what you mean by rational, right? But plausibly, rationality is like a satisficing thing, not like a maximizing thing. I mean, again, this is going to depend on a lot of background stuff about what rationality is, but like I'm a permissivist about epistemic rationality, so I tend to not think of rationality as like this ideal that like human agents probably will never meet, but something a little bit weaker than that. And so I actually think the view you're giving is probably consistent with the claim I'm making in this paper as well, which is that maybe it's not like rational in some maximally like super idealized sense, but it's still perfectly rational for human agents that are philosophers to believe their philosophical views. So yeah, I guess the answer is that I think that's consistent with what I'm arguing, but it's a nice point. Yeah, and again, I also think that we should accept our philosophical views, because I think there's it would be weird if we believe them and then didn't accept them. I think we could lose epistemic benefits as well. So yeah.
Sarah Moss.
Good. I'm going to follow up on Alexandra's point. So, but I'm not taking it in a Laura Buchak statistical evidence direction. So the question is, suppose my friend Dilip, true story, starts with like 0.9 credence that eating meat is morally fine, and then talks to several of us, vegetarian philosophers who think it's almost certainly wrong. And we talk, and he comes to have, let's say, 0.2 credence that eating meat is permissible. And you say, okay, your thesis, it's permissible for him to hang on to his belief that it's fine to eat meat. He was, deeply identified with that before. I'm just not so sure, because now suppose we all go out to dinner and he's deciding, do I order the steak or the tofu? They taste almost the same. The question is, what should he pick? Suppose he says, oh, I'll take the steak because I believe eating meat is fine. So that seems to me like really odd reasoning for someone who has 0.2 credence that it's fine to eat meat. Like he thinks odds are 4 in 5 that meat is murder. He should not be eating the steak. So when the salient practical question is, what should Dilip order? Dilip with his 0.2 credence doesn't count as believing eating meat is fine now. And so in whatever sense it's permissible for him to like still believe it's fine, I feel like the sense of believe it issue should be pretty thin, It seems like almost just like maybe paying lip service to the view that eating meat is fine, because it doesn't seem to really make a practical difference at dinner. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that, because you flipped the example on its head. So it's not like if you were believing eating meat is wrong with the low, like you made the moral risk fit in the way that I think is right. And that's a good case for me to think about. And I think my ultimate answer is I really want to think more about this, partially because I don't think I have to fully commit to the Laura Bushak thing about acting on beliefs in moral context. And this is maybe a good reason for me not to, like these kind of moral risk cases. So I want to think more about the extent to which I want to, how about this, what I want to say about the relationship between belief and credence and action, and when we should act on a belief versus act on a credence. And I think I was more giving that as a possibility for something that might complement what I'm saying here, but not necessarily like this is a nice point against that. And so I want to think more about how I want to spell out that relationship to action in the context of this sort of paper. So that's one thing to say. Response number 2. So I haven't given a threshold here, but I tried to leave it open enough that you could take this kind of case and say, whatever the story is about the relationship between rational belief and rational credence, maybe you could get all the way to 0.5 or 0.4, but maybe 0.2 is just too low. So I think you could also accept a lot of what I said in the paper. Maybe you would want to resist some of that middle section where I was like, belief and credence are radically sensitive to different features of evidence, or at least modify that in some way. But you could say 0.2 is just too low. And I think the thing that Laura says here, which is interesting at least, so I'll just throw it out there. One person can start off believing P, one person can start off believing not P, and then they could come to have the same credence in P, but both maintain the belief attitudes they had before. I think that would commit you to something that's still very controversial and interesting, but not as radical as saying you could believe something with a 0.2 credence. So this might also be a reason to kind of, how low can you go? Not that low, but it's a great question. Thanks, Sarah.
Robert Audi.
Thanks.
Hi, Robert.
Liz, hi. I enjoyed that very much and learned from it. And I also want to follow up on Alexandra's question and add something. I think Sarah brought out the importance of the connection between believing and acting, though no one wants to deny that you couldn't act on a credence without full belief, or so I suppose. Now, I think, broadly speaking, you've made a good case for the consistency of full belief with intellectual humility in a lot of cases. Now, one way philosophers can be intellectually humble is to form second-order beliefs about the status of their philosophical beliefs. And one question I have for you then is what role you want to give to higher order beliefs. And related to that, do we act better in humbly taking account of philosophical opposition when we have a belief that our opponents are credible than when we have, say, a pretty high credence that they are, but not full belief? Arguably, full belief about the plausibility of other people's views might motivate us better to seek more evidence or, take a critical stance on our own view.
Yeah, I think I agree with most of that, or I like the points. I like the idea of this paper being a little bit about intellectual humility. I hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms, but I think that's a really nice point. The second thing you said was sort of about second order beliefs and the role that those might play. So you can tell me if this is what you were thinking of, but I believe belief credence dualism is true. That's my view, right? But I also believe that I could be wrong about that. So yeah, I think that could play a really important role as well. And those second order beliefs actually might be part of what is signifying the fact that my credence in this is not maximal. And so I think that's perfect. I think that's perfectly rational to believe P, but acknowledge there's some chance you could be wrong about P. Knowledge is trickier, whether you could know P and have this possibility of error. But I think believing P is totally consistent with affirming the possibility of not P in some sense, even though I also think it amounts to taking a stance. So there's maybe an interesting tension to think about there, and it might depend on which attitude you're currently reasoning with, whether that's a belief or a credence. So there's a lot there to talk about. But yeah, and I also think too, the third point was about plausibility of other people's views, or whether you have like a belief that they're reliable or just a high credence. And I think either one would work with what I'm saying, like, you know, or like, do I have a belief or just a high credence that like so-and-so is like an epistemic peer? That's kind of an interesting thing to think about. But yeah, I think either one would work with what I'm saying. Yeah, I guess maybe you're right that taking a stand on the fact that they're reliable would kind of force you to give them some more weight. So that's interesting, but yeah, I liked all those points. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we're out of time, with apologies to the rest of the people in the queue, but such is the nature of this session. Thanks again to Chris Meacham for organizing, to Michelle Crabb and the APA for making this happen in these difficult times, and to everyone for coming, and most of all to both our speakers for a pair of wonderful talks. Thank you.
Can I say too, sorry, really quick, everyone who still has questions, I would love to hear them. So just if you don't mind emailing them to me, that would be tremendously helpful. This is a very much a work in progress, so feedback is welcome. And also thanks to Sarah and Chris and Chris. So just wanted to say that. Thanks,
everybody. Stay safe.